Good day, everyone, and welcome to our presentation on expenditure multipliers. Today, we'll be diving into the fascinating world of fixed-price spending plans and exploring how they influence real GDP and aggregate demand. This topic is crucial for understanding economic fluctuations and policy impacts, and I'm excited to guide you through these concepts. Let's get started. On this slide, we outline the key objectives we'll focus on in this module. First, we'll look at how expenditure plans are formed when the price level is fixed, helping us understand the foundation of spending decisions. Then, we'll explore what factors influence real GDP under these conditions, which is crucial for grasping how the economy reacts to changes. Next, we dive into the expenditure multiplier, a powerful concept that shows how initial spending can lead to larger overall economic impacts. Finally, we'll examine the relationship between aggregate expenditure and aggregate demand, tying it all together to see how total spending drives economic activity. This roadmap sets the stage for a detailed exploration of these interconnected economic principles. Here, we see why expenditure is so crucial in macroeconomics. The headline says it all: spending drives economic activity. When households, businesses, the government, and even foreign buyers spend money, they collectively determine the overall output and employment levels in the short run. This spending directly impacts production because businesses respond to demand by producing more or less. Consequently, income levels fluctuate, influencing the broader business cycle. So, understanding these spending patterns gives us insight into how economies expand and contract over time. Here we focus on the concept of aggregate expenditure, which represents the total amount of planned spending on final goods and services within an economy at a specific price level. The key idea is that when prices are fixed, any changes in spending directly influence real GDP. Essentially, if people decide to spend more or less, it causes the overall economic output to rise or fall accordingly. This relationship is fundamental to understanding how shifts in demand can impact economic growth and stability. The image here, with the laptop and trading materials, reminds us that these concepts have real-world applications, especially in financial markets and economic planning. Here, we're looking at the difference between planned spending and actual spending. First, firms create plans for production based on what they expect households and businesses will buy. These planned spending decisions essentially guide how much they intend to purchase and produce. However, actual spending often deviates from these plans, which can lead to unplanned changes in inventory levels. Inventories serve as a buffer, adjusting to help balance production output and sales in the short run. This dynamic is crucial because it influences how firms manage supply and respond to market demand in real time. Here we have the main components that make up aggregate expenditure, which is the total spending in an economy. First, there's consumption, represented by the house icon. This is the spending by households on goods and services, and it's typically the largest part of planned spending. Next, we have investment, shown with the industry icon. This refers to business spending on capital goods, which helps increase future production capacity. Then, there's government purchases, indicated by the landmark dome icon. This includes government spending on public goods and services, which can influence short-run economic output. Finally, net exports, represented by the ship icon, are the value of exports minus imports, reflecting trade's overall contribution to aggregate spending. All these components together help us understand where the total demand in an economy is coming from. Here we're looking at the crucial role that disposable income plays in consumption. Consumption actually makes up the biggest portion of aggregate expenditure in the economy. Essentially, when households receive additional disposable income, they don't just spend it all. They allocate a part of that extra dollar towards consumption and save the rest. This behavior is key because it influences overall economic activity, with higher disposable incomes generally leading to increased spending, which fuels demand for goods and services. The image here of a celebratory glass of champagne is a reminder that much of what we enjoy, like treats and leisure activities, depends on the money people have left after taxes and necessities. Understanding this relationship helps us grasp how income fluctuations can impact the broader economy. Here we see the consumption function represented as a line chart, which shows the relationship between disposable income and consumption. As disposable income increases along the x-axis, consumption also rises steadily on the y-axis. This positive linear trend suggests that higher disposable income leads to greater consumption spending. For example, when disposable income reaches 7,000 units, consumption is at 1,200 units. This illustrates a key economic concept. People tend to spend more as they have more income available after taxes and transfers. Understanding this relationship helps us predict consumer behavior and forecast demand in the economy. Here, we're looking at investment and business spending, focusing on the types of investment and their volatility. Investment isn't just about buying new equipment. It includes spending on new capital, inventories, and residential construction as well. This type of spending can be quite volatile because it reacts quickly to changes in expectations, interest rates, and overall business confidence. For example, if interest rates rise or confidence dips, businesses might delay or reduce their investment plans. The image here of an active construction site really captures how dynamic and tangible this kind of investment can be in the real world. Understanding this volatility is key to grasping how investment influences the broader economy. Here we focus on government purchases within the aggregate expenditure model. Government spending on goods and services like building roads or maintaining infrastructure directly contributes to the total demand in the economy. This is what we call government purchases, and they are a crucial part of aggregate expenditure because they inject money into the production of real goods and services. On the other hand, transfer payments, such as Social Security or unemployment benefits, are not included in this category, since they simply move money from one group to another without directly involving the purchase of goods or services. Understanding this distinction helps clarify how government actions impact overall economic activity. Now, let's talk about net exports and their role in an open economy. Net exports are simply the value of a country's exports minus its imports. They give us a clear idea of how much foreign demand there is for our domestic goods. When imports increase, they actually reduce the demand for goods produced domestically, since consumers and businesses buy more from abroad. On the other hand, exports have the opposite effect. They boost demand for what we produce at home by selling it to other countries. This balance between exports and imports is crucial because it affects overall production and economic health. As you can see in the image, goods are constantly moving across borders, illustrating how interconnected our economies really are. Here we have the aggregate expenditure schedule displayed through a line chart. On the horizontal axis, we see real GDP, which measures the total output of the economy. On the vertical axis, we have planned spending, representing the total amount households, businesses, and the government intend to spend at each level of GDP. As real GDP increases from 500 to 3,500, planned spending also steadily rises, moving from 200 up to 500. This upward slope illustrates the positive relationship between income and expenditure. People generally spend more as their income or output grows. This schedule is crucial because it helps us understand how changes in GDP influence overall spending, which in turn affects economic equilibrium and growth. Recognizing this link allows policymakers and economists to predict how shifts in production levels can impact consumption and investment behavior. Here we're looking at the concept of equilibrium in the aggregate expenditure model. Equilibrium occurs when aggregate expenditure, or total planned spending, exactly equals real GDP, which is the total output produced. This balance is crucial because it means firms are selling exactly what they produce, so their inventories remain steady without any unexpected increases or decreases. In other words, production is perfectly aligned with what consumers' businesses and the government plan to spend. This condition ensures stability in the economy, as companies don't have to adjust their output or prices due to unanticipated inventory changes. The image here illustrates teamwork and organization, much like how different parts of the economy must coordinate to maintain this equilibrium. Let's walk through the expenditure multiplier step by step. First, it all starts with initiating spending. When there's an initial change in spending, perhaps through investment or government expenditure, it raises demand in the economy and sets everything in motion. Then, this spending generates income. The money one person spends becomes income for another, allowing them to continue spending and creating a chain reaction. Finally, repeated rounds of spending amplify demand even further. Each cycle expands the total effect, leading to a larger change in the equilibrium real GDP. Together, these steps show how an initial injection of spending can have a multiplied impact on the overall economy. The marginal propensity to consume, or MPC, represents the fraction of any extra disposable income that households choose to spend rather than save. Essentially, it tells us how much of additional income is poured back into the economy through consumption. Now, this has a direct impact on the economic multiplier effect. When the MPC is higher, people spend more of their income repeatedly, which amplifies the overall economic activity. This means a strong MPC can significantly boost demand and growth in the economy as money circulates more rapidly. The playful image here, with the child surrounded by snacks, reminds us how everyday spending choices contribute to this broader economic cycle. Here we have the marginal propensity to save, or MPS, which is essentially the portion of any extra income that a household decides to save instead of spending it. For example, if someone receives an additional dollar, the MPS tells us how much of that dollar will be put aside. Now, the relationship between MPS and MPC, which stands for marginal propensity to consume, is quite important. These two always add up to 1. This means if you know how much of the income is spent, you can easily figure out how much is saved, and vice versa. Together, they help us understand how changes in income affect both spending habits and saving behavior. The image here of a jar filled with coins and a banknote reminds us of the concept of saving and how small fractions of income add up over time. Here we have the formula for the multiplier, which plays a crucial role in understanding how initial spending impacts the overall economy. The multiplier is calculated as 1 divided by the marginal propensity to save. Another way to express this is 1 divided by 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. Essentially, this means the less money people save and the more they spend, the larger the multiplier effect will be. In other words, when there's a smaller leakage from spending, meaning less is saved and more is circulated, the economy experiences a bigger boost from any initial injection of spending. This concept helps explain why consumer behavior can significantly influence economic growth. Here we're looking at a simple example of the multiplier effect. When there's an initial increase in spending, it sets off a chain reaction. This initial spending leads to multiple rounds of induced consumption, meaning people spend more as they receive additional income. This process amplifies the overall change in real GDP, making the total economic impact far greater than the original spending increase. Essentially, $1 spent can generate several dollars in economic activity, highlighting the powerful ripple effects within the economy. Here we see the spending chain across rounds, illustrating how money circulates through the economy. It begins with the initial expenditure, where a first injection of spending introduces money into the system and creates income for others. Then, this income generation step shows how recipients of that income use their earnings to make further purchases, keeping the flow moving. Finally, additional consumption occurs as this sequence repeats, driving ongoing cycles of spending and income. This continuous process highlights the dynamic nature of economic activity and how one initial expenditure can ripple through the economy multiple times. The image of the scattered euro banknotes helps visualize the movement of money at play here. Here we see the important concepts of leakages and injections in the economy. Leakages, which include saving, taxes, and imports, essentially reduce the amount of money circulating domestically because these funds are withdrawn or diverted away from spending within the economy. On the other hand, injections consist of investment, government spending, and exports. These add extra demand, putting more money into the economy and increasing overall spending. Understanding the balance between leakages and injections is crucial because it influences how strong the economic multiplier effect will be and ultimately impacts economic growth. Here, we're looking at how real GDP is determined when prices are fixed. The key idea is that changes in aggregate spending directly influence real GDP. Essentially, output adjusts to ensure that what's produced aligns with planned expenditure. This means if aggregate spending increases, production ramps up to meet that demand, and if spending falls, output decreases accordingly. This relationship highlights the critical role that aggregate expenditure plays in shaping the actual level of economic output when prices aren't changing. Here, we're looking at the concepts of equilibrium output and potential output, as well as the different types of output gaps that can occur in an economy. First, equilibrium output is the actual level of output where aggregate expenditure equals output. This means that the total spending in the economy matches the total production at this point. On the other hand, potential output represents the full employment level of output, where all resources are used efficiently without causing inflationary pressure. Moving on to output gaps, a recessionary gap happens when actual output falls below potential output. This gap indicates that aggregate expenditure is too weak, leading to unemployment and underused resources. Conversely, an inflationary gap occurs when output exceeds its potential level, signaling that spending is too high, which can cause inflation to rise as demand outstrips supply. Understanding these gaps helps us grasp how the economy can either be underperforming or overheating relative to its optimal capacity. Here, we focus on what happens when aggregate expenditure is low, when spending in the economy doesn't meet the level needed to fully utilize resources. Real GDP falls below its potential. This situation is known as a recessionary gap. As demand weakens, firms produce less, resulting in unused production capacity. Inventories start to build up because goods aren't selling as expected, and as a consequence, companies reduce their workforce, causing unemployment to rise. This mismatch between spending and potential output highlights the challenges during an economic slowdown. Here we're looking at the concept of an inflationary gap. This occurs when aggregate expenditure pushes real GDP beyond its potential output. In simpler terms, demand for goods and services rises faster than what the economy can sustainably produce. This imbalance leads to shortages and upward pressure on prices as resources become strained. As a result, this higher level of output isn't maintainable in the long run because the economy is essentially overheating. The image of a busy street with bustling activity helps illustrate how demand can build up rapidly, creating pressures throughout the system. Here we're focusing on inventories and unplanned changes, which are crucial indicators of how well a company is balancing supply and demand. When we see unintended inventory changes, it means the firm is either producing more or less than what the market demands. This mismatch creates what we call a supply-demand imbalance. To correct this, businesses typically adjust their production levels until their planned spending aligns perfectly with their actual output. This process helps maintain efficiency and prevents overproduction or shortages. The image on the left shows a worker managing inventory in a warehouse, symbolizing this critical aspect of supply chain management. Here we're looking at two important concepts: aggregate expenditure and aggregate demand. Starting with aggregate expenditure, this measures the total planned spending in the economy at a fixed price level. It's a key focus when we analyze short-run economic equilibrium because it reflects how much people and businesses intend to spend, giving us insight into immediate economic activity. On the other hand, aggregate demand goes a bit further by tracking the total demand across different price levels. It captures overall spending from all economic actors, meaning households, businesses, the government, and foreign buyers. This broader view helps us understand how total demand changes as prices fluctuate. The image here shows someone analyzing data on multiple screens, which reflects the kind of detailed monitoring economists do to track these variables. The clipboard icon represents planning and intention behind spending in aggregate expenditure, while the chart icon signifies how aggregate demand is about actual spending behavior across the economy. Together, These concepts help us grasp the dynamics of economic activity from both planned and overall spending perspectives. Here, we're focusing on why aggregate expenditure and aggregate demand are closely related. The key point is that with a fixed price level, aggregate expenditure directly determines real GDP. Essentially, the total spending in the economy translates right into the actual output produced. At the same time, this same aggregate spending influences aggregate demand in the short run, because it represents the total amount of goods and services people want to buy. This is why the aggregate expenditure model is so important. It helps us understand aggregate demand more clearly by showing how changes in spending impact overall economic activity. The relationship is closely intertwined, making it a crucial concept in macroeconomics. Here we have a line chart illustrating the differences between movements along the aggregate demand curve and shifts of the curve itself. On the horizontal axis, we measure real GDP, and on the vertical axis, the price level. The original aggregate demand curve is shown alongside a shifted curve representing an increase in demand. Notice how at every price level, the quantity of real GDP demanded is higher after the shift. That's what happens when aggregate demand increases. Movements along the curve occur when price levels change, but the demand curve remains fixed. While shifts like the one here indicate changes in factors other than price, such as consumer confidence or fiscal policy, causing the entire demand curve to move. This distinction is crucial for understanding how different economic forces impact overall demand in the economy. Now, let's focus on the impact of fiscal policy and how it connects with the multiplier effect. When the government changes its spending levels or adjusts taxes, these actions don't just affect the economy one-to-one. Instead, they trigger what we call the multiplier effect. This means that the initial change leads to a bigger overall impact on aggregate demand. For example, if the government increases spending, it puts more money into the economy, which encourages businesses and consumers to spend more as well. This ripple effect stabilizes the economy by influencing total output far beyond that original policy move. As you can see in the image, analyzing budget documents and making informed fiscal decisions plays a crucial role in managing economic stability. Here we focus on the relationship between taxes, transfers, and disposable income. Starting with taxes, they have the effect of reducing disposable income, which means people have less money available to spend. This decrease in spending power leads to lower induced consumption, ultimately slowing down overall economic activity. On the other hand, transfers such as government benefits or subsidies have the opposite effect. They increase disposable income by putting more money into people's hands. This boost in disposable income supports higher consumer spending, which in turn stimulates economic activity. The image here, showing a hand writing in a notebook alongside cash and a small house model, represents the planning and financial considerations involved in managing these factors. Understanding these effects is crucial for grasping how fiscal policies can influence the economy. Here we focus on the concept of the open economy multiplier. One key point is how import leakages can reduce the overall impact of economic spending. When consumers or businesses spend money, some of that spending flows into imports rather than domestic goods. This means that the multiplier effect, which amplifies economic activity within the country, is somewhat limited because part of the demand shifts abroad. In other words, foreign trade tends to dampen the chain of domestic spending since money leaks out to pay for imported products. The busy port scene in the image illustrates this flow of goods across borders, emphasizing the global interconnectedness affecting our economy. Now let's focus on the role of automatic stabilizers in the economy and how they interact with the multiplier effect. Automatic stabilizers such as unemployment benefits and progressive taxes are crucial because they help smooth out fluctuations in aggregate expenditure without requiring any direct intervention. During a recession, for instance, unemployment benefits provide income support to those who are out of work, helping to maintain their spending levels. Similarly, progressive taxes adjust automatically. People pay less tax when their income falls, which leaves them with more disposable income to spend. Together, these mechanisms help moderate economic downturns and prevent the economy from overheating by automatically adjusting disposable income, cushioning changes in demand. This automatic adjustment supports more stable economic growth and reduces the severity of economic cycles. Here we're looking at some important limitations of the multiplier effect. First, leakages like saving, taxes, and imports reduce the total amount of spending that stays in the economy, which means the multiplier impact is smaller than we might expect. Next, capacity constraints and changing expectations can hold back further production and spending growth. For example, if businesses are already operating near full capacity or consumers anticipate slower growth, the multiplier won't trigger as much expansion. Finally, price adjustments over time also complicate things. When prices change, it weakens the fixed price assumption that multiplier theory relies on, making the actual effect less predictable. These points highlight why the multiplier effect, while useful, has practical limitations in real-world economic situations. Here we're looking at two important concepts, crowding out and crowding in. On the left side, you see a laptop displaying various data analytics charts, symbolizing how these economic dynamics are analyzed. Starting with crowding out, this happens when higher government borrowing pushes up interest rates. As a result, private investment may decline because borrowing becomes more expensive. This can essentially limit how effective fiscal expansion is, as it dampens private sector activity. On the other hand, crowding in occurs when strong private demand encourages additional private spending. This effect can actually boost the impact of government policy measures, especially when the economic environment is supportive. Understanding these opposing forces helps us grasp the complexities of fiscal policy and its influence on the broader economy. Here we see the powerful impact of government spending through the multiplier effect on real GDP. An initial increase in government expenditure doesn't just add its direct value to the economy. Instead, it sets off a chain reaction that amplifies the total economic output by a factor of 4.5. This means that for every dollar the government invests, the equilibrium real GDP increases by 4.5 times that amount. This highlights how strategic government investment can significantly boost overall economic activity, far beyond the initial outlay. Here we see a key graphical summary of the aggregate expenditure model. On the x-axis, we have output measured as GDP, and on the y-axis, total spending. The 45-degree line represents points where output equals planned spending, essentially showing equilibrium where the economy's production matches what is being demanded. The other line plots planned spending at various output levels. Notice how planned spending starts above zero, reflecting autonomous spending even when output is zero. As output increases, planned spending also rises, but not always in perfect alignment with the 45-degree line. Where the planned spending line crosses the 45-degree line indicates equilibrium output. If planned spending is above output, inventories will fall, encouraging firms to increase production. Conversely, if planned spending is below output, inventories build up, leading firms to cut back. This visual helps us understand the dynamic relationship between spending and output in determining economic equilibrium. Here are some common mistakes to watch out for when working with spending models. First, it's important not to confuse planned spending with actual spending. The numbers you plan to spend aren't always what ends up being spent, so mixing these up can lead to inaccurate conclusions. Next, be careful not to mix the marginal propensity to consume, or MPC, with the marginal propensity to save, MPS. Related, but distinct concepts. And confusing them can throw off your calculations. Lastly, remember that not every change in spending has the same economic effect. The impact can vary widely depending on the context, so assuming all spending changes have equal effects is a mistake. Keeping these pitfalls in mind will help ensure your analysis stays accurate and insightful. Now let's work through a practice question to apply the multiplier model. The task here is to calculate how a $500 increase in spending impacts real GDP. This involves understanding the multiplier effect, which shows how initial changes in spending can lead to larger overall changes in economic output. By computing the multiplier, we can quantify the total increase in real GDP resulting from that $500 injection. This hands-on exercise helps solidify the concept by putting it into a practical context. As we wrap up, let's review the key takeaways from this module. First, fixed price spending plans play a crucial role by determining real GDP through planned expenditures at specific price levels. Next, the multiplier effect is important because it amplifies changes in demand, which in turn influences the total economic output. Moving on, aggregate expenditure helps us understand fluctuations in short-run aggregate demand, giving us a clearer picture of economic activity. Finally, focusing on the short run allows us to analyze these concepts and gain valuable insights into economic behavior during that period. Together, these ideas form the foundation for understanding how the economy operates in the short run.